Okay, so last day we talked about that bent configuration, or that two free pairs of electrons that creates that permanent dipole moment within water. And that permanent dipole moment, you can come in and sit down. You don't have to stand and hide. Are you not in the class? Yeah. Why don't you sit down? As you hide around the corner and I'm... All right, so last time we talked about that bent configuration of water. That bent configuration of water leads to that dipole moment, which then allows for that molecule to be able to form hydrogen bonds. That hydrogen bond is what is responsible for the strong adhesion and cohesion of water, so the ability of that water to interact with itself as well as other molecules. It also allows it to solubilize a lot of different constituents, especially that are polar. Things like sugars, ions, and salt, bioactives. So they allow for the transport of molecules through your circulatory system. The other thing that it does is it increases the boiling point and melting temperature of water, which means it's frozen at 0 degrees Celsius, but also that it boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So it has a much higher boiling point compared to methane, which has the tetrahedral structure of water. So all of these characteristics of water give it its very unique properties. Now, when we talk about water and spoilage of microorganisms, water is required for that molecule or that microorganism to diffuse any of its waste products away from that microorganism, or it's got to allow the nutrients to diffuse to that system. So when the water mobility, or when the amount of water drops below a certain point and it no longer can support diffusion of molecules, that's when we get arrestive growth of microorganisms. Right? Because the nutrients and the waste products can't diffuse away from that interface of that molecule. So when we talk about shelf stability of products or of foods, we always want to talk about the water activity. It's probably the most important factor and the most widely applied factor to foods where we actually get a good shelf life. So if it's not the sole responsibility of water to actually induce shelf life, it's always a part of a hurdle technology. So when we talk about water activity, again, it's the ability of that solvent, to support diffusion of either the nutrients to the microorganism and waste products away. So when water is unable to support diffusion, that's when microorganisms stop beginning to grow. So water can exist in 3 states in foods. The first state is in a bound configuration. This can be bound, like we talked about last day, as the clathrate forming around an ion to solubilize it, or as well as sugars. But it can also be integral part of proteins. So when proteins are synthesized, they require to be folded into a very specific configuration. Remember when we talked about the catalytic triads for lipolysis or for breakdown of carbohydrates? Remember that when we talked about those 3 amino acids that were part of that catalytic triad, they were never directly adjacent to one another on that amino acid backbone or on that protein backbone. So that means that the protein has to fold in such a way that that catalytic triad, those 3 amino acids which are distributed along that protein, when it folds, they need to be localized into that catalytic site. So that protein folding, or that protein configuration, requires a highly specific configuration or adaptation, a structural conformation. Water is integral in the folding of protein. So when we talk about bound water, it's water that's closely associated to any other molecule that's no longer available to freeze at 0 degrees Celsius. So bound water, again, is clathrates around small molecules, sugars and salts specifically, and they're the ones we most commonly talk about, but it's also bound into the structure of different proteins. So it can be bound onto a polar amino acid, forming a strong hydrogen bond, and again then making it unavailable to support chemical reactions or support microbial growth. The other 2 kinds are capillary water and free water. Capillary water, again, is bound in crevices. So imagine, again, you have, see, the old example that I was taught, does everyone know what an ink well for a pen is? How it looks? It's got like kind of an open, large bottom and then a thin neck. And if you turn that inkwell upside down, it doesn't spill, right? That's the same concept when we talk about a capillary in food. You have these very, very narrow channels that make water so it has restricted mobility. Capillary water, again, doesn't support microbial growth. It's considered unavailable water. When we talk about microbial growth, it's really this free water we're talking about. And free water is readily available to be removed from that product. So if you put your celery or melon or lemon, whatever it is, through a juicer, the water that comes out is typically your free water. Free water is what supports microbial growth. So when we talk about salting of a product or sun drying a product, we're modifying the amount of water to eliminate that free water. If we can eliminate the free water, we can increase the shelf life by decreasing the water activity. Now, this concept of water activity is, again, one of the instrumental things you should be taking from this course. It's extremely, extremely important. So put a star beside it, much like you did with DZ values. Water activity is probably the most important concept you're going to learn in this course. Now, what is water activity? So if you take a sealed environment, so let's say we take a can of soup. We've got our can of soup and we add water to that. Now that water is going to equilibrate with that headspace gas. So we've got water and we have air. Now, on a summer day, when the temperature is below 100 degrees, puddles still evaporate, right? So after it rains, puddles evaporate. We don't need that water to actually boil. So when water is in a sealed environment, it's going to reach an equilibrium where some water molecules enter the gaseous phase. This is dependent on the temperature at which that food is stored at. So water activity changes as a function of temperature. The higher the temperature is, the higher the water activity is. So it's something to consider when you start talking about developing rations for the military. So I did a project when I was in the US with the Natick Research Center in Boston, where they wanted to know how fast would oxidation happen in a ration pack that was stored in Afghanistan. And they store them in these truck containers that often reach 120, 130 degrees Celsius because of the heat and the confined environment that they're in. So when you have pure water, it will equilibrate and reach some pressure, right? Because as these water molecules move into the headspace, the pressure of that gas goes up, right? There's more molecules in it. Now, if we take the same amount of water, and now we add salt into that water. That salt will then form interactions with the water molecules, right? They'll form clathrates around. So if it's negatively charged, the positive dipole moment of the hydrogens will align around it and will become closely associated. The positive ions will have the negative oxygens surround it. So when you add salt, some of that water is no longer available to go into the headspace, right? So that means we have less water in the air, and if we have less water in the air, that means the partial pressure of that headspace decreases. There's fewer molecules in it. Does that make sense? That is water activity. So water activity is the fungicity, which is a measure of the volatility or the ease of that molecule to go from the aqueous or the water state into the gaseous state. The more solute you add, the lower the partial pressure is because it binds that water and makes it unavailable to move into the headspace or into the gas phase. Does that make sense? Anyone confused on that? No? Okay. So the more solutes we add, the more capillaries, pores, channels we add, the less water that is available to support diffusion. So when we talk about diffusion, it's not just the microorganisms that rely on it, but any chemical reaction where you either have two substrates that have to come together, something like a, I don't know, what's a good example? Maillard reaction. So you have to have the reducing sugar and the protein come in close proximity. Or if you have to have oxygen diffuse through a material, oxygen can be solubilized in water. So oxidation reactions change as a function of water activity. So it's not only the microorganisms, the rate of growth which we're changing, but it's also the rate in which chemical reactions change. So water activity is a very, very useful parameter in predicting shelf life, irrespective of if it's based on microbial spoilage or other deteriorative reactions, i.e. oxidation in potato chips. So again, we often try to change that free water by adding solutes. This is why when you hear or read a book that says sugar is bad for you, well, a lot of sugar is bad for you. It's easy to replace the sensory properties of sugar. We can use artificial sweeteners. We can use things like stevia. What's difficult to do is to replace the colligative properties. And the colligative properties are the ability of that water to bind other solutes. So if we add an artificial sweetener in a case where we have a low moisture food, how do we then bind that water or change the interaction of water so it can no longer support microbial growth? And it's a very, very challenging problem. And it's why processed foods all have either high sugar contents or high salt contents, because it gives a long shelf life, which is desirable in the food industry. So water activity is simply the ratio of the partial pressure of pure water, and so it's the ratio of the partial pressure of the gas phase with a solute in it divided by that of pure water. So it's how much does the partial pressure change when we add a solute or something to bind that water. Again, if we go below a water activity of 0.9, we don't see bacterial spoilage anymore. Below 0.8, we don't see most yeasts growing anymore. And below 0.7, we don't see a lot of spoilage at all. So the molds begin to be subsided. Now, this isn't just to induce a good shelf life. Water activity is extremely important in the making of cheese. So you can select different molds. So if you're doing a mold ripened surface cheese, you need to have a very specific water activity to get that good formation. If it's a blue cheese, a camembert, a brie cheese, whatever it is. You need to have a water activity that's sufficient to allow that microorganism to grow and outcompete any other bacteria, molds, yeasts that are at that surface. So again, the water activity is just the ratio of the partial pressure of the gas in the headspace above a solute or food divided by that of pure water. You have to compare them at the same temperatures because the partial pressure is dependent on temperature. I think most of you will have talked about Raoult's law in first year chemistry. Yes? No? Nobody mentioned Raoult's law? No? Okay. So, if you're having a picnic and you have a pitcher, a cooler full of ice and water, and you put your beer in it, what temperature can that beer get down to? 0 degrees Celsius. If you want really cold beer, what do?
Put salt in the water?
Add salt. Yeah. So why do you add salt?
It lowers the temperature that the ice freezes, the water freezes at.
Right. So that's the colligative properties. So when you add salt, that salt lowers the freezing point. So instead of that water now freezing at 0 degrees Celsius, it's going to freeze at -1, -2, -3, depending on how much salt you put in it. So if anyone's ever made ice cream at home, what do? You take water, throw in a whole bunch of salt, you put it in your freezer, you let it cool down. That gets to about -5, and then you put in your ice cream mix, your baggie of mix, and you squeeze it until it makes a good consistency ice. You have to add the salt to lower the freezing point. Now, just like lowering the freezing point, it also elevates the boiling point, right? So think about the boiling point being a measure of how much energy you have to put into that water to go from a liquid, so those water molecules are all interacting and hydrogen bonding with each other. We have to break those forces, so that energy that we have to put in goes up when you add an ion, because it forms the clathrate, it binds that water. It's no longer available to boil. So now the boiling point goes up. This is what we term colligative properties. Now, Raoult's law is it's not a very good predictor across the whole range of sugar concentrations. So, if you add 1 mole of glucose or 1 mole of lactose, the freezing point depression will be very similar. So the depression of the freezing point is not dependent on the mass of sugar or salt we add, but on the number of moles of sugar we add. Again, remember, 1 ion will associate with a clathrate, so then when you add a mole of that, you're going to bind more water if you add 2 moles or 3 moles. And it's proportionate to the number of moles that you add. Why did this stop working? Of course. Where did I go? There we go. So if you have pure water has a water activity of 1. Right? Makes sense. Now, if you add 2 moles of glucose versus 4 moles versus 6 moles, this is going to be linear. So we can actually predict either freezing point depression or boiling point elevation dependent on the number of moles of a solute we add. This is dependent not only on the number of moles you add, but on the molecular weight. So let's say now we're adding a monosaccharide versus a disaccharide. To get that same boiling point elevation or freezing point depression with the disaccharide, we're going to have to add twice as much mass because the molecular weight is twice as high. So it's molecular weight dependent on the colligative properties of that water. This breaks down after about 10%. So usually we only show this graph with a nice straight line, and we call it Raoult's law. And we can predict the boiling point elevation or freezing point depression based simply on the number of moles we add. But you can imagine that as that solute becomes more and more concentrated, there's going to be less and less water available to form that clathrate. And eventually you're going to get ion-ion interactions, or you're going to have incomplete clathrate formation around that ion. So then once we get to high concentrations, above about 10% sugar, we start to see deviation from this linear perspective. So again, the amount of sugar is linearly proportionate to the boiling point elevation or freezing point depression at low concentrations, below 10%. But again, really, really important when we talk about preservation of dried fruits, vegetables, spices. All of this is really, really important when we look at the shelf stability as well as the deteriorative reactions. So anything that requires an enzyme to undergo a reaction, so non-enzymatic browning of your banana or of your cut apple. Maillard reaction is dependent on water activity. Oxidation is dependent on water activity. So when we try to determine the shelf life of a product, almost always as part of that conversation, we're going to talk about water activity. We do talk about other important factors, antimicrobials that are added, or pH. All of these things play a role, but nothing is as important as the water activity. So when we talk about capillary water, this is instrumental in determining the sensory attributes of that product. So when we talk about bound water, it's not sensory, these are really, really dry, brittle foods. Pasta, soda crackers, things like that. When we get up into capillary water, we start talking about things like meat, jellos, like gelatin gels, starch pastes, gluten. This water is very closely associated with the macronutrients that are present, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and less importantly, the lipids. This water is not available to partake in chemical reactions. Very, very difficult to remove, so you're not just going to be able to squeeze it out, but under intensive drying conditions, you're able to remove this water. Free water, again, is water that freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and that can be squeezed out of that product. It's very, very loosely bound. So this has a lot of molecular mobility. Molecular mobility is very, very similar to water activity. So again, when we talk about something being able to diffuse through a solute, it can undergo chemical reactions to support either deuterative reactions or microbial reactions. So here's a graph I love. It's one of my favorites. And I don't really like it. I like it on exams. It's not like I go home and look at it in my free time. Yeah. I have a tattoo of it on my leg. Okay, so a couple important things. First, notice that none of these curves go to 100%. Why is that? If we go to 100% water, will microorganisms grow? No, we need a nutrient, right, to support that growth. We need some kind of sugar, some kind of carbohydrate, or lipid, or protein for it to metabolize. So this doesn't ever start when we talk about water activity of pure water. So first thing we notice is these three curves here, B, Y, and M. Those are our microorganisms. So again, the rate in which they decline the ability to grow is very quickly inhibited. 0.9 for bacteria and down to about 0.7 for yeasts and molds. But other reactions are very, very important. And they're not always as simple as what we see in microorganisms. So first, we'll look at non-enzymatic browning. So non-enzymatic browning, as we decrease the amount of water, that reaction goes up, and then we get to some critical point, and all of a sudden, the reaction begins to drop. So why would non-enzymatic browning, so this is Maillard reaction, or caramelization? So in Maillard reaction, we require a reducing sugar to come into close proximity to a protein. Now, why would very, very high water activities slow that reaction down? Yeah. So the water would be bound to the sugar. So if we add very little sugar, very little protein, what's going to limit the rate of that reaction? So it's very dilute. The likelihood of that sugar and protein coming in close enough proximity to support that chemical reaction is very unlikely, right? It's dilute. You've diluted out that system so much that the substrates very rarely come into contact with one another. So as we drop the amount of water, we're concentrating the sugars. As we concentrate the sugars, we have more likelihood that they're going to come in close proximity where they can undergo that chemical reaction. So that's why we see that gradual increase up to about 0.65, 0.7. Now, once we begin to drop in water activity, we begin to restrict the mobility of those molecules, meaning the sugar and protein are in a very viscous environment, so it takes a long time for them to diffuse through that substrate to come into contact to undergo that chemical reaction. Make sense? All right. The other one that we like to talk about, so the two biggest chemical reactions when we talk about the food industry is Maillard reaction and oxidation. Oxidation is especially prevalent in lipids, and we'll talk a lot about this later on, but there's a lot of interesting science being done around trying to prevent the rate of lipid oxidation in foods. Why? Anyone know why lipid oxidation is so bad? Why do we not want that in foods? Yeah? Do you know? Yeah? So it produces free, yeah? Right, so it forms free radicals, which are able to interact with DNA, RNA, and actually can cause mutations leading to cancer. The whole theory of aging is based on free radical chemistry. What do we add to try to prevent oxidation? Antioxidants, vitamin E, vitamin C, BTH, all of these artificial and natural antioxidants. So again, lipid oxidation follows another nonlinear profile, and you can see again, where are we? There we go. So as water activity drops, we see an increase in the rate of the reaction, and then a decrease, and then an increase again. So that initial increase is again associated with the fact that oxygen and the lipid is soluble in water. So again, you have to have that mobility for it to take place. As you concentrate it, you increase the likelihood of those reactants coming into contact. Thus, the rate of the reaction increases as you decrease water activity to a certain point. As you get beyond that point, we see a rapid decrease. Again, we're just so viscous, that fluid, that we can't support diffusion of those substrates. But then we see a great increase after about 0.2. And that's a switch-in mechanism, which we'll talk about, which is really interesting. So one, we rely on oxygen diffusing through the aqueous medium. But eventually, if we have no water left, oxygen can diffuse through the air within that food matrix. And we can have an increased rate in autooxidation. And we'll talk about this in about 2 weeks. So the rates of chemical reactions, as well as microbial growth, is dependent on the water activity of that food. And we can predict the shelf life based on water activity. Now, when we talk about spray-dried powders, so this can be a starch, a flour, it can be a milk protein supplement, it can be your instant coffee. As a consumer, we don't often work with dried powders. In the food industry, we work with them all the time. So when you talk about your coffee, how many of you drink instant coffee in the morning? Two people. Okay. How many people drink percolated coffee in the morning? What's percolated coffee? Like drip coffee. So like Tim Hortons or Starbucks is all percolated. So when we talk about drying foods, remember, the structure of food is complex. There's pores, there's channels, and as you pull that water out of those channels and pores, you get a collapse in structure. Does that make sense? So again, you have this think of a gel, think of a protein, a gelatin. Leave it on your counter for a couple days, let some of that water diffuse, you're gonna notice it starts to shrink, right? That phenomenon is referred to as hysteresis. So when you remove that water, you see a collapse in a lot of the microstructure. So those pores that were once there, the channels that were once there, collapse. We've removed the water that was holding them apart. Once we've removed them, they collapse. When we add the water back to, so we're rehydrating your coffee. So in the morning, you take your water, you pour it on top of your coffee, it's hot, it solubilizes. That deviation between the absorption profile and the resorption, so you're removing water on the top profile, you're adding water on the bottom profile. The water activity is not simply predicted based on the amount of water content. It would be if we were just adding solutes. So if we were talking about clathrates, it would be the same. But when we start talking about the capillary water and those channels and droplets coalesce, break, deform, whatever it may be, once that structure changes upon removal of water, adding back the same amount of water doesn't give you the same water activity. So you've dried a food, you've then added back the exact same amount of water you removed, and all of a sudden the water activity is completely different than it was before. That's because the capillaries and the pores that were initially holding the water have collapsed, and now they're no longer available to reabsorb that or rebind that water. Yeah?
Greater water activity in the rehydration?
Always. Yeah. Yeah, because we have less capillary water. So this produces a big problem when we try to create starches and protein powders that we're going to reuse in the food industry. And we have to account for that, bless you, and you have to reaccount for that once you add protein back into that system. So you actually have to add less water back to rehydrate your food than you took away and to get the same water activity. So that phenomenon is known as hysteresis. Again, the desorption and reabsorption profiles do not superimpose. The only time they superimpose is if you're talking about sugar crystals or salt crystals. In any complex food, fruits, anything with long chain carbohydrates or proteins, we see that hysteresis. Now, this is almost always, I don't know if it'll be this year, but this chart is an excellent example of a type of question I can ask on water activity. And there's a lot of really important things we're going to look at here. So first, if you have pure water, the water activity of that is 1. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. If you freeze water, the water activity drops. Remember, water activity is a measure of the molecular mobility. So when we talk about ice, ice is confined in a network and it's unable to diffuse or unable to support diffusion of reactants or nutrients and waste for microorganisms. So when you freeze ice, the water activity drops. So in a frozen system, so your frozen TV dinner, you decrease the water activity when it's in the freezer. So it doesn't support microbial growth. The two that I really want you to look at carefully though is skim milk powder and macaroni. So skim milk powder and macaroni both have very, very similar moisture contents, 10 and 11%. Look at the difference in the water activity. So for macaroni, it has a water activity of about 0.45, whereas for the skim milk powder, it's much, much higher at 0.6. Same amounts of solids, same amounts of water, but the water activity is different. Why? That's the question I love to ask on the midterm. So why do you think macaroni would be more efficient at binding water than skim milk powder?
Could it be due to the polarity?
Yes. So carbohydrates, sugars, and long-chain carbohydrates, polysaccharides, amylose, and myelopectin, they're very polar. There's a lot of alcohol groups, right, on the sugars. So that water can form very strong hydrogen bonds with the polar carbohydrates that are added to that system. In proteins, we have two different main classifications of amino acids. We have apolar amino acids, right, tryptophan. We have polar amino acids, cysteine. So the amount of water that's bound to a protein is less than to a carbohydrate because the polarity of a protein is more apolar or more nonpolar. So it binds less effectively that water. Does that make sense? So when we talk about proteins, typically, if we had a same amount of protein as carbohydrate, the carbohydrate will always have a lower water activity. Now, if we look at these two, raisins and skim milk powder, we have a huge difference in the amount of water. So with skim milk powder, it's 11%. With raisins, it's about 27% water. And they have identical water activities. This time, it's because sugars are concentrated in what? Did I just say the answer? I did, didn't I? I said sugars are concentrated. Raisins have high concentrations of sugars, which are more effective at binding water, right, than carbohydrates. So, water content is a useless parameter when we talk about the preservation of foods. It's water activity that's important. And this takes into account the molecular mobility of that water and the ability of that water to migrate or have diffusion properties. And again, not only is the microbial population's growth dependent on the water activity, but also the spoilage chemical reactions, non-enzymatic browning as well as enzymatic browning. Okay, everyone has seen a diagram like this before, I hope. This is a phase diagram. So water can exist primarily in how many different states? 3. Gas, liquid, solid. Anyone know the 4th state?
Is it the transition state between, like, for example, water and gas? the state that you have to add more energy for it to like be converted to gas?
So that's not a state, that's a transition. A transition temperature. Yeah.
Is it supercritical fluid?
Right, supercritical fluids. Anyone know where that's used in the food industry right now? Decaffeinated foods. Anything that's decaffeinated undergoes supercritical carbon dioxide extraction. Anyone know what new industry relies heavily on supercritical extraction? The cannabis industry. So if you want to make THC or CBD oil, so you don't want to inhale it, you want to eat it or drink it, it relies on supercritical extraction. So when we undergo a transition between states, it's dependent on two external or environmental factors. The first is the temperature. What temperature does water boil at? 100 degrees Celsius. At what pressure? At 101 kPa, right? Kilopascals. So we're at about 101 kPa depending on what the barometric pressure is. Depending if a storm's coming, we're right around 101. So water actually boils at a lower temperature in Colorado, right? Because it's such a high elevation, the pressure there is lower, so it boils at a lower temperature. So the food industry uses this all the time. So if you have a heat-sensitive product, so when you go to the grocery store and you buy your can of frozen orange juice, we have to eliminate water. So when we eliminate water, if it's at 100 degrees Celsius, what happens to your orange juice? Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, they're over here. Do you guys want to just take a spoon and pass them around? It's really heavy. Yeah, we can start passing them out. We'll get there in a second. Here, we'll start passing these out here. So when we move from one state to another, it's dependent not only on the temperature of that system, but also the pressure. So we have orange juice. We want to create a concentrated orange juice. We do that by adding heat and boiling off water. Now, if we do that at atmospheric pressure, what's going to happen to that orange juice? It's going to brown. It's going to undergo caramelization. So what do? We pull a vacuum onto it. If we pull a strong enough vacuum onto it, we can lower the boiling point to 20 or 30 degrees Celsius, which is not hot enough to undergo caramelization or Maillard reaction. So the boiling point, the freezing point, is dependent on the partial pressure or the pressure of that environment. We can manipulate that by changing the pressure and lowering the boiling point. So there's a couple different reactions in the food industry that we relied on this. Freeze drying. So those marshmallows in your Lucky Charms, or freeze-dried ice cream, so astronaut ice cream. Freeze drying is a very, very effective way to take away water without breaking that structure. So remember when we talk about removing water, we get the collapse of that structure. If it's frozen, it doesn't collapse. So we minimize that hysteresis, or we maintain that structure of that original product. So in fruits, if you ever look at like a freeze-dried strawberry, it's got a nice, crispy, fairly porous structure because we didn't see a collapse. Vacuum evaporation in things like orange juice. We don't very often use evaporation at above 100 degrees Celsius. Again, just because there's so many chemical reactions that can actually begin to happen that we don't often just boil off water at atmospheric pressure. If we pull a really strong vacuum, we can actually be a frozen food and we can sublimate that water. So this should all be fairly familiar with first-year chemistry, right? Evaporation, sublimation, condensation. We rely on these reactions all the time. And we've already talked about this. So when you get to really high pressures and really high temperatures, a gas actually begins to behave like a liquid. So we get to see solubilization of compounds into that gas phase. So you purge a gas through your food, and in the case of coffee, the caffeine goes into the gaseous state. You then drop the pressure back down, goes back to a gas, the carbon dioxide, and all that caffeine precipitates out. So it's a really, really effective way to separate stuff. And this is what typically the cannabis industry is using to actually develop CBD oils, and THC oils. Okay, we can start handing these out now. What I would do is just walk down. Can you just walk down the middle and kind of pass them out? So when we talk about frozen foods, when we convert that liquid into a solid, what's that? It's ice cream. Sorry. So this is just a plain vanilla base, a plain vanilla ice cream base. So this is actually Dr. Goff, who usually teaches this course. This is his primary formulation that he uses to teach his ice cream course. If you don't know, Dr. Goff is probably the world's leading expert in ice cream science. There's been a course here, a 2-week industrial course that's been taught on ice cream science here that's been going on for over 100 years now. So Guelph has probably one of the strongest reputations in ice cream science. Now, when we talk about frozen foods, when we freeze that food, we immobilize that water, right? We convert it from a liquid to a solid configuration. So that ice stops microbial reactions from happening. Now, something else very important happens. So in whole foods, in things like meat, vegetables, when we freeze, we see the expansion. When we see the expansion, we see the rupture of cells and we see drip loss. In this system, obviously that doesn't happen. We don't have cellular structures that we're worried about breaking. Now, what I want you to be noticing when you eat this is how smooth the consistency of this ice cream is compared to a store-bought. You should notice you cannot sense any graininess in that ice cream. So, ice cream is really, really complicated. So, when we talk about that freezing of water, so what happens is first we see an expansion. Now, in this ice cream, we have about 10% fat, we have quite a bit of sugar, and we have some polysaccharides that we add to it. So as that ice, I'm going to jump this. We don't really need to know too much about that. So when we have the conversion of ice or water to ice, we see the expansion of that water. Again, whoops, sorry. For some reason, this doesn't work backwards. What slide am I on here? So we see that expansion of water into ice crystals. How you process that or how you freeze that ice cream is very, very dependent on the size of the ice crystal that forms. So imagine in the winter, you have your crop on the field. The worst thing that can happen is you have a really gradual cool into a low temperature below -5. If your crop is in the field, when that happens, those ice crystals begin to form, they begin to grow. As they grow, they begin to rupture cells within that plant. That causes all kinds of browning reactions to begin to happen and a lot of loss. So when we talk about making ice in foods, we want to maximize or cool that food as fast as possible. This does two different things. The first thing it does is the faster we can cool it, the more crystals form. So the faster we cool, the greater number of ice crystals we have. Now, there's only a certain amount of water molecules that can freeze. So if we have a whole bunch of crystals, they're going to grow to smaller sizes. Does that make sense? So you have more nuclei, that same amount of water is going to freeze. If you have more nuclei, the crystals are going to be smaller. So one thing we try to do in the food industry is cool as fast as we can. So in this system, we use what's called a scrape surface heat exchanger, which basically is allowing us to freeze very high viscous products. So as that ice cream begins to freeze, it becomes more and more and more viscous. So a scrape surface heat exchanger basically has a cylinder that has ammonium going through it, so it's very cold. And then on the inside of that tube, we put the ice cream through. And there's a baffle that moves around and scrapes the crystallizing ice off of the surface. The other thing it does is that shear that we're putting in breaks the ice crystals down. So when we talk about frozen foods, we want very, very small crystals. You don't want to be able to sense them in your mouth, right? You don't want that graininess. So when we talk about the supply chain of frozen foods, it's very, very difficult to maintain that small ice crystal structure. So every time we have an increase in temperature, some of that ice melts, and then when we cool it back down, that ice, that water, freezes again. Now, there's a parameter, a thermodynamic parameter, that wants to minimize the interface between phases, right? So those ice crystals tend to grow. So as that temperature as we abuse that product with the cycling temperatures, ice crystals grow. So when you go into the grocery store, every time someone opens that cabinet to make a decision on which ice cream they should be picking, the cold air is coming out and hot air is rushing in. Every time someone opens that door, you get a small change in the crystal size of that ice cream. So gradually, in time, we see a recrystallization and we see larger and larger crystals growing until eventually you see a freezer burnt layer of ice cream on top where you have very, very large crystals. No, you can just leave it. I'll let them grab them another one. You can take some if you want. Take a few. Whoops, I meant to pause it. Okay, so what they've just done is taken a bottle of water and put it into the freezer for an hour and a half. So that bottle of water will now be at the temperature of your freezer. What temperature is most household freezers? -3 to -5. So what temperature does water freeze at? Who thinks water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius? Who thinks it freezes above 0 degrees Celsius? Below 0 degrees Celsius? It actually freezes below 0 degrees Celsius. From a thermodynamic perspective, ice will always melt at 0 degrees Celsius. And this is why a lot of people think ice will also form at 0 degrees Celsius. So if you think about the boiling point, water boils at 100 and it condenses at 100. But water doesn't freeze at 0 degrees Celsius. Why is that? So imagine when you have a water molecule, right? That water molecule is hydrogen bound to 3.4 other water molecules, and that dipole moment is balanced. Now, when it freezes, it has to expand. Upon expansion, it forms a new crystal structure. So now it's bound to about 4 other water molecules. That changes the interfacial tension between the water and the newly formed ice phase. When you have an interface, that is thermodynamically unstable. There's an energy associated with it. So to crystallize or to form a nuclei, you have to overcome the energy associated with the formation of a new interface. So you always have to subcool below the melting point to get it to freeze. This is what we call supersaturation or supercooling. So supercooling is the temperature you have to crystallize at below the melting temperature. So pure water melts at 0 degrees Celsius, but depending on how you cool it, it can freeze anywhere from -5 to about -25. So if you really, really, really remove heat fast, you're not giving it the kinetic time it needs to form a new interface and to crystallize. So this water that we see here is subcooled. It's below the melting point. So thermodynamically, it wants to crystallize. But it can't because it needs energy to overcome that new interface. So what will happen if you bang it? So has anyone ever... I always ask this question every year, and I never have a student put up their hand, and I'm always so dismayed. Has anyone ever, as a kid, played with water in baggies and put it in the freezer and then take it out and slap it? Probably not. I must have had the most strange childhood of anyone I've ever met. So, and I still do it from time to time, and I do it with my kids all the time. So take a bottle of water, like just a regular bottle of water, or fill a Ziploc baggie and put it in your freezer. Wait until it gets below 0, so wait about an hour, and take it out and be very, very careful not to shake it or agitate it. So if you wait that hour, see that? So that slap has created enough energy to actually form that new interface. So you smack it, you put a little bubble in, and now all the ice forms on that little bubble, and we get rapid growth. So this is illustrating that water has supercooled below the melting temperature. It's cold enough to freeze, but we just need to give it that extra little bit. So again, it's cool, isn't it? Do it at home. It's just like that. If you're a bartender, there's all kinds of really cool things you can do in mixology, in molecular gastronomy, with ice like this. Again, notice how the person's not trying to get any bubbles. Put an ice in. Do you see the ice growing across the surface? So if you go to really high-end bars like that are ranked internationally for mixology, this is the kind of stuff they do all the time. Oh, I thought the clapping was on here. I'm like, why are they clapping? Cool though, isn't it? So if you're a bartender and you want to get serious points, just throw some water in the freezer at the beginning of the night, and you can use it as a pickup line. You think I'm joking? Science is the best pickup line. Serious. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later. This is also used in chocolate manufacturing. So remember when we showed that chocolate with that gray surface, that bloomed chocolate? So when you talk about polymorphism or the crystal structure, if you throw a little bit of solid, a little bit of crystal into a supercooled system, it'll adapt the configuration of that chocolate, which we'll talk about. So it'll actually adapt the proper beta form 5. This in fat manufacturing is a process called seeding. Happens all the time in the food industry. Okay, so when we talk about this ice cream, there's a lot of things that are really important other than just the size of the crystals. So first, when we add sugar to ice cream, as we begin to freeze it, we're freezing out water, right? So as we freeze out that water, the sugar that remains in that system begins to become concentrated in that unfrozen phase. It doesn't become part of that crystal structure. So we have water crystallizing out, it's forming nice water crystals, and around those water crystals is this unfrozen phase of water and whatever's soluble in that water. So in this case, sugars and polysaccharides. This depresses, so the more sugar you add, it depresses the freezing point of that unfrozen phase. You can imagine, you don't want all that water to be frozen, or else you'd be sucking on an ice cube, right? You want that creamy mouthfeel, that texture, that's soft. So there's three things that are really important when we make ice cream, when we talk about the textural properties. The first is the overrun. The overrun is the amount of air you incorporate into that mix. This has 100% overrun. That is your typical Chapman's ice cream. So when you buy a brick of ice cream for $4 or $5, that's got 100% overrun, meaning there's an equal amount of ice cream mix to air. So half of that brick of ice cream is just air you're buying. When you buy Ben & Jerry's, right, those little Haagen-Dazs tubs, they weigh almost the same amount as those large 2-liter Chapmans. The overrun in Ben & Jerry's is, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's somewhere around 40 to 60%. So we have about 40% less air in that container. That's why a container of Haagen-Dazs costs $6 or $7 for far less amount, because the volume of ice cream is very similar in those two containers. So the amount of air is one variable. The amount of fat is another variable. So the amount of fat gives you that creamy mouthfeel. And the third one is this whole interrelationship which determines the size of the crystal. This is dependent on the freezing point depression, which is dependent on the amount of sugars or solutes we add. Remember the colligative properties. The more sugar we add, the more the freezing point depression happens. So as those ice crystals begin to form, anything that's soluble in it, so the fat, the protein, the carbohydrates, the sugars, they all freeze concentrate. So the sugar in the unfrozen phase is very, very high. We get a nice freezing point depression. Make sense? Okay. So this is the exact same thing, just what I've drawn. I've drawn it instead. So if we look here, so here is our pure water. So as we begin to freeze, we begin to pull out water, we begin to concentrate sugar. As we do that, the freezing point of the unfrozen phase begins to decrease, decrease, decrease. Now the two different lines here, we're not going to worry about for this course. We'll talk about it in third-year chemistry, food chemistry. But this deviation is just because the solution viscosity is so high that it takes time for that unfrozen water to migrate to the crystals to freeze. So there's a kinetic phenomenon associated with freezing of ice cream. So again, as we begin to freeze out that water, we begin to freeze, concentrate the solutes, we begin to freeze, concentrate the polysaccharides. So when we make good quality ice cream, it's imperative that we add enough sugar. That's why when you start to get, I can't say it, sherbets and frozen yogurts, you'll notice a much coarser texture. It's because we don't have enough sugar in it. We don't get that freezing point depression. So there's a lot more ice being formed. If there's a lot more ice being formed, the size of those ice crystals increases. So it becomes grainy. Whoops. I've already talked about that. So this is Dr. Goff. He was my master's advisor. So Dr. Goff studies the interactions of all of these constituents in food, the proteins, polysaccharides, sugar, and air, and fat, and water. And he understands, or tries to understand, how to make the best texture ice cream possible. But also, how can we make ice creams more healthy? So the biggest thing we need to do to make ice cream more healthy is two things. One is to decrease the amount of sugar. Very, very challenging to do because you need that freezing point depression. You need to maintain that unfrozen phase. The other thing, which is really debatable right now, is you want to remove the amount of fat. Now, again, we'll talk about this in the lipid stuff, in the lipid section. It's a huge debate right now whether or not saturated fats are bad for us. In the case of ice cream, it's predominantly saturated fat because it's animal-based. And again, it makes a lot of challenges to remove the amount of fat. But again, this whole idea of these ice crystals forming, creating this unfrozen phase then determines how likely the ice recrystallization is. So we add different gums to increase the viscosity of that unfrozen phase to prevent different defects, which again we'll talk about in food chemistry. We're going to jump this. You can watch that at home. That's just a video of scraped surface heat exchangers of how they work. This doesn't show up very well, unfortunately. But ice cream, again, is incredibly complex. Not only is it dependent on the mechanism in which we produce that ice, so how we crystallize it. This is why homemade ice cream isn't very good. Homemade ice cream is very grainy, has very large crystals, because you can't get that degree of undercooling and that shear we implement with the scraped surface heat exchanger. It's also dependent on the amount and type of sugar we add, the amount and type of polysaccharides we add, how much protein is present, how much salt is present, and all of these different interactions play a very complex role in determining the ice crystal size as well as the mouthfeel of that ice cream. Now, kind of along the same concept of a frozen food, we have the concept of a glass. Now, unfortunately, none of these doors have a window in it. A glass is just like a pane of glass. So a glass, I used to teach, is an immobilized liquid. So imagine as you're cooling down a liquid, a sugar solution, a polysaccharide solution, the viscosity begins to go up, right? So as viscosity goes up, the mobility goes down. If you can cool something below its glass transition temperature, the molecular mobility goes to 0. So the analogy I like to give, if you're at a dance club and the person, the DJ, slowly begins to turn down the volume, everyone slowly walks off the dance floor and goes and stands by the bar. That's crystallization, right? So you have time to walk over and everyone lines up along the bar and you get rows of people, and that's a nice crystal structure. Now, you're at that same dance club and you're dancing like a fool, your arms above your head, the music just cuts off. Everyone, what do they tend to do? They freeze like a deer in headlights, right? Their arms are all out, they're in the middle of their dance move that they were just wrecking. That is a glass. So you've cooled it so quickly that those water molecules don't have time to migrate to the crystal structure and form that nice lattice. A glass is this weird amorphous, what looks like on a microscale a liquid, but is actually a solid. So think of a pane of glass. You can see through it, so there's no crystal structure, it's not hazy, you can see right through it, but you tap on it and it doesn't move. It's a solid, right? So a glass is an immobilized, and I'm going to put liquid in quotation marks because there's a really cool study that I just found. So I've been teaching this wrong up until this year because I've always said it's an immobilized liquid. If that's the case, and you take a glass, so you take your pane of glass, and you leave it there for millions and millions and millions of years, eventually it should get a crystal structure, right? So if it's immobilized, so imagine we turn down that music, that water molecule can walk over. In a really viscous environment, it's going to take a long time for that water to migrate, but eventually, over millions and millions and millions of years, it will make its way to form a crystal structure. So what they did is they actually found this amber that was 20 million years old, and they did X-ray diffraction on it. And X-ray diffraction, you don't need to know this, if there's a crystal, gives a nice sharp peak. And by looking at those peaks, you can determine if it's a crystal or if it has this really broad peak, which is amorphous. So the argument would be, if this was a liquid transitioning to a solid, those peaks would change over millions of years, and they don't. So this study shows that a glass isn't actually a liquid. It's a weird type of solid that has no structure. So again, when you think of a crystal, you think of molecules that are all lining up in a very specific configuration. A glass is solid-like, so when you take it in your hand, is the same looking as a crystal. It's got the same hardness, it doesn't flow. The difference being, it doesn't have any structure. It's amorphous. Those molecules are in the same configuration as you would see in a liquid water. So glasses in foods. If you ever go to your grandma's house and she's got that old candy jar and they're really hard candies and they're all stuck together, those are glasses. Pasta, dried pasta is a glass. An eggshell is a glass. There's all kinds of examples of glasses in the food industry. Another one that doesn't commonly get thought of as a glass are freeze-dried powders. So your instant coffee in the morning, your milk powder, your whey protein supplement. These all are glass-like materials, meaning they're solid, but they're not crystalline. So again, when we talk about these, we're talking about powders, we're talking about pasta. Typically, the glass transition temperature goes up as the molecular weight goes up. So think about a pasta. It's going to be a glass at room temperature, right? Your box of pasta you keep in the cupboard, it's rock hard. Lower molecular weights have to go to lower temperatures. So if you want to make a glass out of, let's say, glucose or lactose, if it's not concentrated, so you can make a glass by boiling off that water, and then you get a little hard candy. Or you can make a glass, as I go through puberty, or you can make a glass by freezing out that water, right? So the glass then becomes the unfrozen phase. Anyone know of a frozen dessert that's a glass? There's one. You can't buy it and keep it at home. That's your clue. Usually you see it at fairs, at like Walt Disney World, or at shopping malls. Not cotton candy. Was that what you were going to say? Dipping dots. Anyone ever heard of dipping dots? Now, dipping dots are really, you don't know what dipping dots are? They're so good. Oh, they're like little drops of heaven. So dipping dots are really unique in that if you go in and buy a good pack of dipping dots, you can pour them out, right? Each little sphere doesn't stick to the other sphere. That's because you've immobilized the unfrozen phase. You've made it solid-like. So you've put it into the glass transition. In the case of lactose, which is what they predominantly use in dipping dots, the glass transition temperature is right around -30. So your home freezer, if you put a pack of dipping dots in it, when you go back and get it, it's a thing of ice cream, right? You lose that structure that you get from that glassy state. So dipping dots spent millions of dollars trying to find a way to get that glass transition temperature above -5. Why? So then they could go through the retail market. They weren't able to do it. So you can't buy dipping dots at home. They could do it, but they had to add things that made it so unpalatable that it just didn't ever reach market. Where did I put my pointer? So, every molecule can form a glass. Pure water can form a glass. Pure carbohydrate, pure protein can form a glass. Now, if you think about a crispy cookie, Chips Ahoy, let's say, when you bite that cookie, it's brittle. So when you talk about sugars, we have all different sugars, and if you're into confectionery science, the structure of the sugar will determine the mouthfeel of it. So you can have a crystalline sugar product, something like a pan-coated Skittle, so it's really brittle, really grainy, a Skittle. That is a crystal structure. We can have a glass of sugar, something like a Werther's Original, really hard and brittle, right? Really smooth texture, that's a glass. If you add something that has a lower molecular weight, it's going to reduce the glass transition temperature. So if you add more water to a cookie, it becomes softer. But if you add more water to a cookie, what happens to the shelf life? It goes down. So when you talk about making cookies, what is the primary structuring agent in a cookie? There's two big ones. One is sugar. What's the other one? Long chain carbohydrates, polysaccharides, flour, right? So that flour forms a glass. If you add something that's lower molecular weight, it's like diluting it and giving it mobility. So certain sugars will actually reduce the glass transition temperature. So you can add a sugar to this cookie, a special sugar, which we'll talk about in carbohydrate chemistry, that lowers the glass transition temperature. So instead of being a really brittle, hard cookie, it becomes a really chewy one. What's important, though, is that we're not using water, because if we relied on water to decrease the hardness, we would decrease the shelf life. So we have to be able to add a plasticizing agent which increases the molecular mobility of the glass-forming compound. In this case, it's the longest chain carbohydrate we have. And by doing that, we can actually change the sensory properties of that product. So when we talk about confectionery science, if we're making a fudge or a caramel or a hard candy, it depends on which monosaccharide or disaccharide we use, because some molecules, some sugars, have a very, very high tendency to form crystals. So again, think of a pan coating on a Skittle. While others form glasses. Think of your hard, clear candy. So depending on what you want, you can actually select for it by selecting the appropriate sugar that's unable to crystallize. And we'll talk about that next week, maybe the week after, in the carbohydrates. This is a good place to stop.